To start discussing waste generation, we need to know what is the main classification of wastes. Uh, Waste can be classified into different categories. That is by their state, solid, liquid, or gaseous, origin, municipal, commercial, and industrial, or construction and demolition, or agricultural. And the practical use, which can be food waste, packaging waste, or the type of material, which can be metal, paper, etc., or by the properties of the waste, whether this is recyclable, combustible, compostable, or by safety level, whether it is hazardous or non-hazardous. Here I show you a general classification of waste according to their properties, and that can be classified into biodegradable, non-biodegradable, hazardous waste, and non-hazardous. And this is the typical classification of waste worldwide. Sources of waste can vary, but we can classify, this is one example, into municipal services, agricultural waste, construction and demolition, and mining waste. But these sources of waste does not cover the whole spectrum. We know that we have other sources such as biomedical waste, fishery waste, radioactive waste, and e-waste. E-waste is a type of waste that has been subject to many debates worldwide because it is usually allocated and disposed along with the municipal solid waste in developing countries. And developed countries are aiming now for recycling more electronic waste, which is not always possible due to many reasons hampering the recycling of the e-waste that we will discuss later. We are going to start our discussion on global waste generation worldwide with these figures. To understand these figures, I'm going to explain first how waste generation has a strong correlation with the income level. In the past 20 years, municipal solid waste generation rates have stabilized in high income countries and have been experienced a slight decrease in some countries, possibly due to the increase in environmental awareness and conservation. But while municipal solid waste generation is known to be independent from the shift of manufacturing industries to emerging economies, industrial waste quantities are affected. In order to forecast the waste generation rates in the future, there is a need for population estimation. So these figures, these projections, consider this how the population will increase in the future. We can actually discuss how different the waste generation is seen according to the income level. So as you can see, high income countries are the ones who produce more waste. So they get the 46% of the waste generation, followed by the lower middle income countries. But now I want you to see the figure on the right side. So these are the 2010 numbers, and they are compared with the projected 2025, the projections of 2025. This is urban population in millions, and waste is kilograms per capita per year. And the country income group is classified as lower income, lower middle income, upper middle income, and high income. As you can see, as in contrast with the first figure, the lower middle income countries are the ones who will actually generate more waste among all the classifications by 2025. Can we have an explanation on this? Can you think about how our habits or our economic growth affects waste generation? This is tightly linked to these numbers. So it's not only about how the population will increase, but it's also about how we desire the desire of having goods in general, and how do we want to um, have what the high income countries have, and why high income countries have a slight increase but not significantly high. Well, it has to do with the fact that there is more environmental awareness, for instance, and it's a more educated population that they starting to feel to be aware of the consequences of waste. One example of the difference on how much the low income countries and the high income countries generate is the difference in the type of waste that is being generated. So higher income households tend to generate more inorganic material from packing waste, whereas lower income households produce a greater fraction of more organic material. So what influences waste generation and management? Think about the economic level, as we discussed before, but think about other information that can drive waste generation and management. So the most obvious driver that we know is, of course, population growth. We know that waste generation is linked to population growth, but think about uh, the level of education. Think about weather, for instance. If it's a dry area or a humid area, that also drives management practices and waste generation, or the characteristics of the waste. We just discussed income level, but think about also technological awareness or drivers. Those are also important things. Think about how life changes throughout uh, the year, like the our waste generation varies with the time of the year, depending on whether we have consumed more or we consume less, for instance, in the time of festivities. Waste generation and management is driven mainly by population growth, economic growth, because greater wealth results in more waste from renewal of material goods, infrastructure development, and increased emphasis on technological change. So this affects the types and quantities of the waste. For instance, the shift from paper to digital communications has greatly reduced the amount of paper that is wasted, right? Another example of economic growth has to do with now the constant change of cell phones, for instance. How often, think about how often you will change to the new generation of phones, and what do you do to the old phone? That's something important to take into account. In terms of technological change, we can also mention that e-waste mainly, right? So we now have used more technology devices. While the quantity of e-waste items is growing strongly, we need to think that the weight of these wastes is rising more slowly because items are getting lighter. So all these things, imagine how adaptable has to be the waste management practices to be to cope with the changes on the type and characteristics of the waste. This is very important to understand how difficult is waste management and why developing countries mainly struggle with these practices. Another important influence on waste generation and management is the access to recycling markets. Recycling is often not possible in towns and settlements that are a long way from the major population centers. For example, Northern Territory. where so that difficults recycling practices. But also, when we think about recycling markets, also we need to know who wants the recyclable material, and whether this is a constant demand or it eventually stop. And this has happened before, so we can actually have a good discussion, because Australia has important issues now with recycling due to this variability in markets. So waste policy is also an important driver of the waste generation and management, because of course waste management is driven by government regulation and policy. Another driver now is carbon policy. You will see, and may already know, that waste, the fermentation of the organic waste, for example, generates methane, which is a greenhouse gas. And if carbon policies are being implemented, this gas cannot be released to the environment. So we need to think about how can we capture these gases to avoid greenhouse gas emissions, which are related directly to the carbon policy. Now that we have discussed what influence waste generation and management, we're going to see the global solid waste projections. In order to forecast the solid waste projections, there is a need for understanding that these concepts, these figures are made based on population growth and also urbanization rate. Urbanization rate is important because it helps to estimate future waste generation rates and compositions, as well as waste, how this will vary depending on the level of development of the country. So these projections are divided, the lines indicate the shared socioeconomic pathway. So SSP1 means that 7 billion population is 90% urbanized, and development goals are achieved, and fossil fuel consumption is reduced, and populations are more environmentally conscious. So SSP2 means business as usual forecast. That means that we will continually grow as a population, and we will reach 9.5 million, and 80% of this population will be urbanized. SSP3 means 70% of the world's, which means 13.5 billion, live in cities, and there are pockets of extreme poverty and moderate wealth, and many countries with rapidly growing populations, right? So you can see that the last SSP2 and SP3 are probably the less desirable because they show that we will continuously increase the amount of waste that is being generated, while the only one that has a forecast more where we can reach a steady state on waste generation is the shared socioeconomic pathway number 1, right? We know that the projections are not so positive. So now we have on the right side the projections if we follow the shared socioeconomic pathway number 2, which means business as usual forecast. But these lines represent regions. So we have the Sub-Saharan Africa, East Asia and Pacific, Europe and Central Asia, South Asia, Latin America and the Caribbean, Middle East and North Africa, and high income and OECD countries. So you can see that the forecast for Europe is the most desirable one in terms of waste generation. But this is waste generation in millions tons per day. It's not per capita. So it's clear that Europe has lower population, lower population than as compared to Latin America, for example. But we can see, for instance, that East Asia and Pacific will reach also a steady state in terms of waste generation, along with at the same rate as compared to the high income countries. And the one that will keep growing is the sub-Saharan Africa. So now I'm going to present to you the quantities of municipal waste in Australia. So these are the megatons of waste generated per territory. Think about, why do we have significant variations in the amount of waste depending on the territory? Think about how the territories have different regulations, for instance, or they have different urbanization patterns, right? This will make us understand why do we have different amounts of waste generated, and also what are the practices, the management practices. There are other important reasons for the difference in waste generation in this figure. It is important for you to understand that some waste is actually generated in one state, but is transferred to another. So, for instance, in recent years, large amounts of waste have been transported from New South Wales to Queensland for landfilling.